Professor Antonio Ceriello, and I am in charge of this initiative. And particularly, I will be also the chairman of the incoming webinar entitled Update Guidelines for the Management of Intermediate Hyperglycemia, Type 2 Diabetes in 2025.
What are the updates in the guidelines for intermediate hyperglycemia/type 2 diabetes management in 2025?
We will had during the last World Congress in Bangkok the presentation of new IDF guidelines on how to manage intermediate hyperglycemia and type 2 diabetes. Let me spend a few words trying to explain what means intermediate hyperglycemia. This is a new definition of prediabetes. This definition settled by the WHO and also accepted by IDF and aiming to define the former prediabetes definition has been chosen because the idea is that people with prediabetes can not necessarily get diabetes, because it's well known that people having this situation of a dysglycemia, intermediate hyperglycemia, prediabetes, if treated in the right way, can avoid the appearance of diabetes. So the meaning of the WHO introducing this new definition is to give hope to people in such situations to overcome the risk of developing diabetes. There are substantial news in these updated guidelines coming from IDF. And the main news are related to the possibility of having two different levels of treatment for the management of diabetes. One, of course, is the best option available, best available option, considering all the available tools, not only drugs, but also tools that are coming from the new technologies. But and also to have the possibility for a minimum treatment which people living with diabetes deserve all around the world. You know, very often the IDF guidelines are used as a reference for the in different states to set the reimbursement of drugs, what could be allowed to use, and so on. And that is why IDF decided to also give the minimum choice for the management of diabetes, meaning that less than this cannot be acceptable in any part of the world. The second important news is that for the first time is introduced the concept that you can start immediately at the diagnosis with a combination. This is something important to take in consideration today, because the possibility of having immediately a treatment with the combination, meaning at least two drugs together, is really emerging as a need for an optimal treatment of diabetes. On the other hand, we have at least 8 different pathways behind diabetes, you know, the octet by the Fronso. So it's very difficult to understand how one drug, which usually is just targeting one of these 8 different pathways, can solve or can let's say, that help to have the best treatment. It's clear, so that also usually happens in hypertension treatment. The concept that we can start immediately with the combination of drugs for the management of diabetes has been also introduced in the management of hyperglycemia in diabetes.
What is the likely impact of these updates in the management of patients with an early diagnosis of prediabetes/intermediate hyperglycemia?
The early treatment of this condition is mandatory to avoid the development of diabetes. Earlier the treatment, better the prognosis for how to avoid the appearance of diabetes. But we have to say, according to very new evidence, that this approach will pay not only in terms of preventing diabetes, but also of preventing the appearance of complications. We cannot forget that the situation of dysglycemia, intermediate hyperglycemia, prediabetes, as you want, is accompanied by a very high risk, particularly for cardiovascular disease. And we have a very recent study showing, for let's say clearly for the first time, that if you avoid the appearance of diabetes, at the same time you also avoid the appearance of the risk for the complications, particularly for cardiovascular complications. So it's really the case to have a very early treatment of this condition.
What are some of the major challenges impacting a successful primary prevention program for intermediate hyperglycemia/type 2 diabetes?
Always let's say the challenge is how to implement any kind of a strategy for the prevention of the appearance of diabetes in the people at risk. Of course, we have the need to implement a lifestyle change. This is very well known, but always it's very complicated, difficult, particularly to keep this lifestyle change in the long term, because these people cannot stop. What I mean, cannot have an improvement of physical exercise or the diet for a short term, but even for let's say 1 year or more or less the same period. But they need to have this approach for all the lifelong. Clearly, in this scenario, the possibility of using drugs, and particularly to use metformin, is very important. We have strong evidence that metformin can prevent the appearance of diabetes in people at risk for developing diabetes. And metformin is very safe and also very cheap. So the use of this drug to prevent diabetes is very well established all around the world and works really very well. So you see, we have some new news, very interesting news to discuss, particularly during the webinar, which will be held on May 28th from 11 to 12 Central Europe summertime. And we will have two eminent speakers. One is Professor Stephen Colagiuri from Sydney, who was a co-chairman together with me for the development of these IDF guidelines. And the second one is Professor Linong Ji from Beijing. Why? Because the new guidelines of China, which of course China is not only a big country, but also is the country having the higher number of people living with diabetes, they are very close to the IDF guidelines. So we'll have the opportunity to understand how these guidelines are now introduce, let's say, allowing a better treatment of diabetes, and with more in details, we can learn what happens in China, probably the biggest country with the biggest number of people living diabetes in the world. So, see you next May 28 at 11 Central Europe summertime to discuss these news in the management of diabetes and pre-diabetes, or much better, intermediate hyperglycemia. See you.